Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 214th New Social Environment. I'm Catherine Olson, Director of Advertising here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Tishan Hsu and Martha Schwendener. We're also thrilled to have the poet Maggie Dubri here, who will read to close today's program. To begin, I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters on which we stand. And finally, especially today, as we remember Martin Luther King Jr., the Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprisings in response to murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McCaddy, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rashard Brooks, Raya Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, Toyin Salau, Walter Wallace Jr., and countless others we have lost to white supremacy and police violence in this country. We acknowledge that justice will come from the streets, from the nation demanding accountability and refusing to move on until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of the state. Before I introduce our guest and host, we'd like to begin with a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce today's guest. Tishan Hsu's artistic practice has been probing the cognitive as well as physical effects of transformative technological advances on our lives. Through the use of unusual materials, software tools, and innovative fabrication techniques, his enigmatic paintings and sculptures explore and manifest poetic new ways to engage and reimagine the interface between organic bodies and technology. Our host today, Martha Schwendener, is an art critic for the New York Times. Her criticism has been published in Art Forum, Book Forum, Art in America, The New Yorker, The Village Voice, and the Brooklyn Rail, among many others. And without further ado, Martha, please take it away.
Hi, thanks. Hello, everyone. And the only other part of that introduction, and that most people don't know, is that I'm an art historian too. That's what I spend most of my time doing, working on art history, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But in a sense, we're dealing with that today as well. And my real enthusiasm for Tishan Hsu's work comes from that, not just what's going on in the present, but the sort of longer history of art, of technology, of bodies, of sculpture, of object making, photography, a lot of other things. To begin with, though, I'm just going to share my screen, and so that we can look at some of his work that I'm assuming many people have seen. If you haven't seen it, the show was at the Hammer in Los Angeles, and then at the Sculpture Center in Long Island City, and this is where I first encountered it. I felt a little embarrassed, I have to say, that I hadn't heard about his work beforehand. I mean, for me, it was really encountering a new artist. But that's, in a sense, how art history works, and also historiography. I write, as I will mention, on somebody who was kind of forgotten from the same period, a writer, a philosopher. And what we see is that sometimes people kind of aren't ready for certain images or ideas or objects because the thinking seems very either future oriented or so strange in the present. And so I don't want to say that this work that we're looking at was ignored. It was highly celebrated, but then there was a kind of quiet moment. And so that people like me who came into the art world a little later, it wasn't part of the canon in a sense. So here are some of the works. These are really just installation shots that you've got here from the Sculpture Center. And I was hoping that Tishan could maybe walk us through just for a few minutes and sort of focus on perhaps how these were made, a little bit maybe where they came from in terms of his background. I know in architecture and in, studying at MIT and technology. cognition, things of that nature. Tishan, is there a kind of entry point? The other thing I would point out too is I'm very curious about how they're made. You know, I've seen photographs with lots of paint tubes and things like that in your studio. And I know you started out in a sense as a painter as well. So anything you want to focus on to sort of tell us about?
Well, there are multiple ways that I could begin to talk about the work. I guess I'll try to summarize it and not get too far into it at this point. And maybe as we talk further, more specific questions come up. Looking in retrospect now at this body of work, which covers what, 1980s into the 90s, I have a very different sense of it in a way than I had when I was doing it at the time. In that this was a very intuitive process from the very beginning, and I did not have any kind of explanatory text to provide to explain what I was doing. And I think that was difficult for people to understand the work because I wasn't giving them anything to go with. And that was somewhat frustrating for me. I emerged at a time when critical theory was emerging in a big way in the contemporary art world in the 80s. I was very aware of the text and of the discourse, and I could see lots of parallels to what I was concerned with. But at the same time, I saw a lot of things, I felt a lot of things intuitively that I felt the texts were not addressing. And so I think that's partly why the initial reception was very strong, but then people didn't know where to go with it. And at the same time, I'm giving you a little bit of side context for this work. I could see that the market was really beginning to accelerate as a driver in contemporary art in the way that it never had. And I felt very much under pressure. I just happened to emerge in a very visible kind of gallery situation. I did not choose that explicitly. That's just happened to be where I landed. And the pressure of market was beginning to really, how should I say it? It's a little strong to say disrupt, but it was definitely interfering with a much slower internal process that I had started out with. And artist friends were actually advising me and saying, you have to be really careful here because they could see the clash. And that was one reason why I decided to work in Germany for a couple of years. So anyway, to go back to the work, so this was very intuitive, and my concerns were about the body and technology. It was very simple. And all of the work is really my efforts to come up with something that's visual, that would somehow convey this paradigm that I felt was beginning to, that would become very influential, that would have a huge impact on our reality, and that I was already seeing happening in much simpler ways. So for me, Martha was mentioning whether it was the future or the present, and many people asked me that. I was not trying to imagine a future. I was really just picking up from what I saw in the present. But as many, art historians and cultural writers often say, is that the future is really the present. It's just generally a culture lives in the past, and understandably so, because it's much easier and we're patterned to go by what has already been patterned. So for me, I was just trying to address what I saw in the world. And the context was, and this I was sort of surprised coming into New York, that the context of the contemporary art world then was how to go into the past. And so the past for me was not something I could connect to in order to generate my work. And in retrospect, there could be several different reasons. One of which was I felt the past couldn't address the issues that I was seeing in the present. By past, we mean obviously that in terms of past styles or past ways of working or past discourses. So that drove me to need to create something visual that I felt could address what I was seeing. And I didn't have any context that I felt was doing that, although in recent talks, it's been brought to my awareness, and I totally agree that I think in music and perhaps in literature, they were, I felt in some ways, ahead of what was going on in the art world from my perspective. And I very much related to a lot of that. So for instance, even techno was already merging them. People talk about the films like Crash, or the science fiction at that time had a lot of this kind of techno science quality to it, where the body was being infused into, or was being inserted into technology. So there were definitely currents going on, but in visual art, and I keep saying visual because, you know, I'm in a sort of boundaried context here that this work is proceeding with. And so with that in the background, I was trying to figure out a way of how I could infuse a technological consciousness with body, and that's it. And in retrospect, looking at all the work, because for me, this has all been, in a way, is new to me to see all the work together for the first time in my life with the Sculpture Center show and with the Hammer show. It's really, and where in the process of doing it, it felt very scattered, and nothing really cohered or made sense. It was doing this and doing that, and I didn't really understand, you know, what the big thing was in the work. It just felt like lots of experiments. And every time I would do one body of work, I would already see the next step to go, and I wasn't really so focused on creating a body of work for a show, which was also partly what was frustrating for me. So, but in retrospect, I see that it's really about an embodied technology. And that's it, really. And it's how to, well, I could say more precisely about the affect of an embodied technology. And that is, how is this going to feel? And so that was partly the difficulty. It's that I was interested not in, let's say, doing video work. And in college, I did both photography and film, and I very seriously considered being a filmmaker. And I thought film was going to be the media of the future. But I saw that as the culture was beginning to just adopt this screen modality coming from the job that I had, that there was some new kind of affect of just our relating to a screen object that to me was really interesting. And something that I felt, even though I wasn't working in a media that was technological, like film or video, or that there was something that perhaps a more traditional media could address. And that is this kind of this sensibility that is created when we're interacting with these technological objects at that time. Now we say devices or screens or what have you. That this is a new kind of interface that frankly is unprecedented. And I felt that this was going to be a major new paradigm. And I think I'm beginning to read more writers who are beginning to talk about it in that way. And that it is, you know, something of the magnitude of writing or printing in history, that this interaction with the screen and with the digital is transforming everything in an extremely ubiquitous way. So it's with that in mind that I began to do the work, and they started out in perhaps more traditional media. I was painting on wood panels. So if we can go to the early, let's say, image 3 or 4, these were, and so my background was in traditional Western painting, and I had a pretty rigorous background from very early on. In elementary school, I was taught by someone who was painted in the school of Thomas Coles from the Midwest when I was in Wisconsin, and I was copying Edward Hopper paintings. And then I moved to Virginia, and I was studying with painter Marianne Harmon, who still works, and she comes from, and I say comes from, she herself was taught by a person who came from the French tradition of Impressionist painting, and that's where I learned about color. So this is very traditional disciplines of what painting was about. And that is where I was drawing from in these early works. Now, the dilemma I had at this beginning works that you're seeing here, just on wood, if we could hold this image, Martha, is one that as I was sitting and working in front of a word processor in the early days of the screen, I felt that there was this screen world, which was very different than TV, that I was totally immersed in. At that time, it was with text, it was word processing, but it was a monitor, it was a screen. And, you know, I was spending hours on it, and I wasn't feeling like terribly bored, actually. There was something that was compelling about it. So this was an illusionary world. I said, this doesn't exist. This is just in this screen in a different way than television was, because I was interacting with it. And so I think it's the interactivity was like a jump from the passiveness of TV. And then at the same time, and as I was working in this job over 3 or 4 years, the software people began to develop more where it was responding to you. It could spell, you put in one word and it spells the word for you. So that's very common now. By that time, that was new. They would just introduce it, every month something new would come like that. At the same time, I'm sitting in front of this object for 4 or 5 hours a day. And so my bodily kind of physical material presence was still very much there. So I felt there was this paradox of an illusionary world, and at the same time, my physical reality of my body, and that I needed to account for both. That as opposed to a lot of future projection, as technology was emerging in the 20th century, in the 70s and 80s, that it wasn't just going to be a virtual world that we're moving into, and we're all going to be replaced by computers, and then we're just going to become sort of irrelevant. I felt that my body in front of that screen still really much counted, and I felt also by maintaining the body, that's when I could begin to also address the political, because it's the body, and specifically the body in pain, that really creates politics in some sense, in a sort of ontological level. And so for me, that was very important to be able to address in whatever kind of, how should I say it, syntax that was going to develop. And that's really what I was doing. I was trying, I'm saying this in retrospect. I had no awareness of this while I was doing it. I was trying to create a syntax for beginning to address the issues in the world. And so all of this work that's in the Sculpture Center of the 80s and early 90s, or actually goes up to 2000, is somewhat removed and abstract from the world. And I think that's one critique people had maybe about the world. It seemed like a kind of fantasy. But I was really trying to change the syntax of painting. So in that sense, I did not want a square image, an image in the sort of square window of a canvas. So that paradigm of painting, where we're looking into a window of a world that's kind of an illusion, a kind of imagined world, I wanted to break away from. I wanted these things to be objects on the wall, coming from, I think, the issues that were raised with minimalism and post-minimalism, where contemporary art began to really be more in the space that we're in. So in that sense, I was trying to establish how I can get that object there. And that's partly what drove the idea of the rounded corners. And that these flat boards are removed from the wall. So they're really floating on the wall. These are just 3/8 inch plywood, and then I just painted over them. Now, for those of you who haven't seen the work, all of the organic shape is just completely flat. So it's an illusion of some materiality. And then the bright colors or things that maybe look like concrete or material, that is actually projecting from this flatness. So it was both maintaining an object and at the same time creating windows into an illusionary world. Now, in a more formal sense of painting, I was looking at the history of painting in Western art, looking way back to, let's say, old master painting, and saying that's really interesting that they were also painting an illusionistic world. And much of it was really religious iconography. So there was a point in Western art history where you could only paint whatever feelings or emotions you had through this kind of biblical iconography. And that was kind of an illusion. And it was an amazing rendition of the illusion of reality, like the landscape or the body. And so here I thought it was interesting. I'm trying to go for something illusionary. It's not biblical, it's technological, or it's the illusion of something organic, if not the body itself. But I wanted it to be an illusion. In that sense, it's kind of invoking trompe-l'oeil, which is something that looks like something. But I didn't want it to be like you're going into a fantasy world either. So there was a paradox. And I think that's the key word. I wanted it something that was going to be paradoxical. And I think that's partly what contributed to a kind of strangeness that people felt looking at it. And people were often very surprised that this was all painted because it looked on the first glance like it was just all made. So at the one hand, it's recognizing itself as this object, and at the same time, there is an illusionary world, but that illusionary world is responding to the object. So if you'll note that in the forms and shapes, they're still within the shape of the object itself, as though they could actually be three-dimensional. And so it was this close, how should I say it, responsiveness between the illusionary aspect and the physical that was in front of you. And I think that relation is partly of what was, how should I say it, is kind of paradigmatic of the interactivity of digital media itself.
Can I bring in one other thing here, one question, because we're talking about painting, we're talking about sculpture.
Mm-hmm.
How about photography? And part of the reason I'm interested in that is because particularly, we could look at that one, but I'd rather one of these and a couple, the next one and the first one. Now, of course, we're in this moment, and this is what's important about photography, is in the 80s, you had this movement from chemical to digital photography, and now we're beginning to see, you know, the photography can be 3D printed, and that includes organs, skin, weapons, you know, those kind of things. So when I saw these works, and this one as well, the one on the opening page, this, but also say particularly one like this, how is photography, I don't know, are photographs involved, or how did you go about this?
Okay, so photography played a key, became a key aspect of the evolution of the work. And that happened going from the 80s to the 90s, where the work I've just been talking about was all, you know, done in traditional media, oil on wood. But I felt from the response partly to the work at the time, people weren't getting it at all. They were going all over the place. And I said, I needed to really clarify that I was dealing with the body and I was dealing with technology. And so one idea was I needed to think about how I could work technologically. And so I began with the silkscreen as one that you print it, and so it's manufactured. And at the same time, once I was using silkscreen, I could then bring in photographs of the body. And that made things very clear. There's no way they could say that this is about this or this is about that in a kind of surrealist way. And that's what drove me to develop the work in silkscreen. So if you go to the one, Martha, that we just looked at.
I don't seem to be able to go to backwards, so I'm going to have to scroll fast through. Okay.
Yeah, let's say this one. This was the early one. So here I'm just experimenting with black and white silkscreen. And this is, the way this is made is, this is modular, which is also is a big sort of structural paradigm of all my work, in that technology is designed and produced modularly. So modularity also plays a big part in contemporary art in the 70s, 80s. So the square module I did by hand. These are hand painted. It was just one module. And then I photographed that and then had that put into a dot screen matrix and then printed that with silkscreen. So that was a very common process of silkscreen, if anybody's done silkscreen. But what I was trying to do is to take the dot aspect of silkscreen. If you looked closer at this work, the dots are very large. And by doing that, I could then bring in these couple of images that are from medical textbooks and put those into a dot screen matrix and then print them so that the whole screen is just dots. And what I was trying to do is to fuse them. So I could just duplicate this one module and then this one other module with a round circle that also was hand painted. But at the same time, now I have the two images that really pin this kind of painted, illusionary, organic body-like or tissue skin-like image into something that we know right away is about the body. And so for me, this was just making it clearer because people were trying to figure out what I was trying to do. So it's a technological process, and then it's about somehow the body. At the same time, in going into silkscreen, I wanted to maintain the affect of handmade, of more traditional media. And that was very important to me. And so the fact that I could make these ripples by hand gives me a certain affect that was important to me that I'm fusing with the sort of, I say it, the clinical affect of body from the medical images. And that kind of continuum between the affect that happens with what we make by hand in the traditional way of art making and the more technological production of images was very important to me, that I wanted that continuum, the both of them to be in the work. If we go to the next image, so this is like 2 or 3 years later, I wanted to get rid of the grid now. So it's like almost I'm trying to put things together in a very crude way, and then I wanted to fuse them and then let them expand into a new kind of just continuous surface. So here, this was really partly just a technical experiment of how I could create my images with very almost invisible lines. So the affect you really get is not this gridded modular flatness, but this continuous surface in which these, whether they're actual images of body or created images, emerge out of this continuous flatness. And why I was doing this is I was going for something that would be just very continuous. I mean, go on in sort of an infinite space. That for me was kind of a metaphor of the web. And there was a lot of discussion about the web at that time, what it was going to be like, what it would do. Nicholas Negroponte's Being Digital was published. And I was imagining this sense of infinite space somehow that was virtual. And that's what drove this imagery, but also even the scale. So I was not trying to do a big painting in sort of the masterpiece mode, but rather to see what would happen if these modules could just keep going and going and going in a very continuous way. And that also was the affect that drove the tile pieces. So I'm sort of bringing in now that a lot of this, what I was struggling with was also going on with this work in sculpture, and that they're very aligned.
Can I just cut in there for a minute before we move over to the more, the ones off the wall, let me put it that way. You have been mentioning the screen, which is just incredibly important, I think. And this quote sort of bubbled to mind when you first started talking about the screen. Lev Manovich, the media theorist, said, I don't know, within the last decade, maybe it was 12 years ago, he said that we don't know whether we're the society of the spectacle or not, but we're definitely the society of the screen. And so I'm thinking about that a lot. And of course, in my capacity as an art critic, I'm constantly seeing painters in particular who have to respond to this idea when we're talking about two-dimensional surfaces of the screen and the fact that people are looking at screens all the time. So how do you shift over? One of the things in terms of this work, and you've touched on a lot of the things I would have brought up, surrealism, minimalism. There are other people that, I have in here an image of the Linda Benglis that you mentioned in that Long Times article, which was a very interesting one. We could look at that if we wanted. But the thing also that you're mentioning, which is, with this kind of modernist idea, is the grid, and then how that gets moved over in the 80s. And that's something I'm very interested in. And two of the ideas, one, which is a word I've seen you use, is this idea of mesh. And then the other, of course, is the big 80s, early 90s word in terms of matrix, So this idea of the grid in the digital age becoming something else. There's a writer an artist who, Thomas Byrell, he had a show at,
New Museum, I saw.
Yeah, at the New Museum, and it's somebody that in the art historical work that I do is somebody that I've been sort of close, to in those terms, and it's different. It tends to be more technological, more industrial slash technological things than the body. Yours is this a very intimate, close relationship, but it's just something that I wanted to point out because, as I said, this becomes, for me at least, although I don't think it's too much of a stretch when we see the color here and knowing that you have this strong background in color and your knowledge of it, that this has this kind of flesh matrix, that the two-dimensional work becomes a kind of skin. So rather than, for instance, the Renaissance window in painting or the modernist grid, we start to have this thing that gives the illusion of this kind of breathing, kind of warp and weft. Also, another one that I really love that you mentioned in that Times article, you said that you were interested in these textiles. And I was like, I thought that was such a great thing though, too, because with textiles, first of all, there's that historical, the connection between, say, the jacquard loom and the early computer. And so the loom and the weaving, but then in more recent, iterations, for instance, I'm thinking of skin and textiles and things like that. But for instance, in combat, which is where maybe military things are, where many things are invented technologically, they have those bandages that they put on that, can staunch heavy bleeding and things like that. So this idea of rugs and also the other thing too, I have to say about the rugs that I think about is, whenever you look at a rug and people say, hey, this can go on the wall or it can go on the floor, so it kind of reminds me of some of your work in terms of these objects that are sort of cascading, from the I wouldn't say from the wall to the floor, but these, where they're a sculpture, and then all of a sudden they're floating or melting onto the floor, particularly these. So those are just and then it's also funny because the grid is here in terms of the tile, which feels very much in terms of some of the other things that you've talked about in terms of a laboratory. Or I like this, people talk about the studio as a laboratory quite a bit, but you mentioned it at one point, kind of like a hospital space, where like operations taking place. Just real quickly, since I'm mentioning it, and I pulled these things up. Here's the Linda Benglis that you mentioned at MIT, and I wasn't particularly familiar with this work, with these cantilevers and the dripping from 1971, which is kind of amazing. And then another person that I had thought of, people mention people like Ashley Bickerton, but there are also sculptors like Joan Wallace, and other people working in this very modular way that I see it, from the distance of, 30 years of how do you sort of encode this idea of the market and things like architecture. Oh, that's this book that you mentioned, The Future. We'll talk about that later, but I'm kind of running all over the map now. But anyway, those are some basic thoughts in terms of other associations, but also this idea of the screen, the grid, you know, the sculpture on wheels, which is incredibly prescient in terms of, you know, we see that a lot now where people make their sculptures as these kind of quasi, I mean, it looks, you know, like something like a commercial display, but also, like I said, this one in particular, like a kind of hospital apparatus.
Mm-hmm.
I have plenty to go from here if you want me to keep going, unless you have any thoughts before I continue.
Martha, it's great you brought up all these images. You've touched so many issues. I sort of almost don't know where to begin. The grid, I'm amazed you brought up the rugs. That was kind of always been a kind of private passion. It began more as a kind of, you know, a decorative thing when, you know, I never really knew about Oriental rugs. And then I think when I was a student or something, I saw one and actually saw one for the first time, you know, a good one. And I was just amazed materially, the fact that someone made this, it just blew my mind. And then later, after doing some of my early work, I was looking at the rug more, and I have a very small one that I just was, and I realized these were sculptures to me. And at the same time, the use of color, and that if you study them and look at the backing, they're grids. So I didn't know that any of this until sort of slightly retrospectively, but the fact that you're seeing these connections is kind of amazing to me. And
to be fair, you mentioned this in one of the pieces, in one of the interviews. So I wish I could say I were that perceptive.
But someone might see that I mentioned it and not see, you know, really see the connection. But so anyway, I think there is something perhaps unconscious going on there. For me, partly it's, you know, these were made by hand. We don't know who made them, but they are in some ways very technological. In that they are, you know, there's this grid that's set up and the person is putting in this materiality into it. And then this materiality becomes something like a whole nother world, a kind of illusionary world that's quite amazing. And that the one thing that struck me when I started doing the flat tile pieces is that on the floor, you see them as rugs. And then as you get closer, you see them two-dimensionally looking down. So there's this paradox again that I spoke about earlier of the screen and the object, so that there's this illusionary world, but then as you move around there at the same time, it's this physical thing in the world. And for me, these rugs are like a sculpture if you think of Carl Andre's steel plate pieces on the floor. So to go from that, and I think the Beilar is a very interesting connection. You know, he uses a lot of repetition in a very intense way, and he gets a tremendous affect out of that. And I think that there's that sort of affective technology he's really getting at with this work. And I'm looking at this one on the right that you have your cursor on right now. Yeah, I mean, I'm working right now in Photoshop, and that's exactly what Photoshop is producing, that work using Liquify. So it's fascinating, the connection of his work, which is very material, to the digital or the virtual. So to go back to the grid for me was beyond the kind of grid of, you know, minimalist conceptual work that we have. I'm thinking of, let's say, someone like Hanna Darboven, or I can't think of right now, but many artists, painters were working in a grid format as a new kind of organization for the pictorial image. For me, it was like kind of the next step. When I was a student, I happened to be working right next to Nicholas Negroponte's architectural machine, where he's kind of inventing for the first time a 3D software. And the computer that he needed to do that, which he was creating from scratch, was the size of like an 8x10 room. But I could observe the screen he was working with, and that the space, the way he was defining the space on that screen was a grid. And it was a flat, we call now the topology, was this flatness that moved through space as a way of defining space. That we now have in software. If you use any 3D software, they put you into a 3D gridded space as a way of even thinking about space. So for me, that's partly where the grid came from. And the flat tile pieces really were about this kind of technological space of data, and that it would go on and on. And I was trying to do it perhaps in a very kind of retro way of an actual physical material, rather than just hopping into the computer and going with it.
Yeah.
I'm describing this thing that's in front of you, but then it's continuous, going on, and it also floats. So if you actually see the work, it's like it's off of the floor, and there's no sense of base to it. And that was an affect I wanted in all of the work. So whether it's hanging on the wall or eventually became on wheels, I want everything to feel contingent, that it could be here or it could be there, anywhere. So that was something I felt was another affect. And I'm using the word affect a lot because that is what I was, that is what drove the work here. I wasn't trying to say we are now in a technological world, that I'm, let's say doing a video or showing people, using their computers. I was trying to get at some sense of what the feeling of all of this technology is. And so for me, contingency, or this continuous surface quality, or this sense of illusion, these words, these adjectives are what I was going for. Why I wanted to do it, or what is partly unconscious, but it was also a sense that we really didn't understand what this new interface was doing to us. And in order to do that, we first have to understand, what are we really feeling here in front of all this stuff and interacting with this stuff? So there's this kind of cognitive, emotional, psychological resonance going on between us as this organic body and this screen. And that is just becoming more increasingly affective and effective, in the sense that it is affecting us in deeper and deeper ways. And so I felt this is important for us just to become conscious of, in a way, just to stop a minute and say, what is going on? And that's what was driving these physical attributes in the work.
I'm going to jump ahead and then move back. But in addition to affect, I would say I'm just going to put up my favorite book, The Posthuman Glossary. A bunch of my students are on here. They already know. They're like, not that again. God, here she goes, But this is my favorite book, among my favorite books. But in terms of this idea of affect and embodiment that obviously we're seeing, and this is why your work from the 80s, from the 90s, looks so just incredibly canny, is because we are thinking in terms of like what is the body in front of the screen, but what happens when you start to have the screen inside the body, for instance. The other thing that I want to put out there is, and we're going to talk briefly, or hopefully we'll talk briefly about critical theory for a minute. And one of the places, in addition to posthumanism, is trans theory. That for me, when you go through, this is an amazing keywords a glossary, and it's, what is it, 255 pages of terms. But when they start, some of the terms in here include things like biometrics, biologics, biopolitics, brain imaging, somotechnics, surgery, things like that, that we're starting to get. And this is one of these areas where, for instance, the control of hormones, of bodies, that we're going into progressively these new worlds of being a body in the world, that overlaps obviously with art. And art is one of the places where it was kind of, you could almost call it theorized or visualized first. Let's see, before I do that, I want to show people a couple of things that they wouldn't have been able to see. For instance, this catalog that the Sculpture Center was gracious enough to send me, I think it's from 1986, of your show, yes, 1986, of your show at Pat Hearn. And I like looking at it very much. I actually quoted it in the little review I wrote for the Times. But it's very interesting, some of the different sources you draw from, say, for instance, Derrida, and people who were thinking of philosophy. This work that people have often described as weirdly predating an early Instagram logo. You know, some of the new geometries that you discuss. And one of the things I like very much in here is that you have this poem, and it made me think of the Richard Brautigan poem, the All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. So this, what you had said earlier, that you thought visual art was maybe lagging behind things like literature or music in terms of thinking about these new worlds, whether they were technological or digital or new forms of embodiment. The other thing I wanted to do, I mean, we're beginning to, believe it or not, run low on time, is I wanted to show them the images that you sent me of, where is it here, of your early Photoshop works. And then if you feel like, you could sort of choose any of these things that you want to discuss, whether it's the catalog, or we could talk about critical theory too, whichever you like. What do you feel like discussing?
Well, I think I could go on with this digital work since you have the images up.
Okay.
I also want to talk a little bit, I don't know what I would say, quite critical theory. Can I work with this too? No, only you can. Okay, so let's go scroll down a bit.
Okay.
I mean, this is more just this is work I've never shown. This is just experiments I was doing when I first started working with the digital. It
Right.
was, it just appeared kind of for the consumer, for the artist to work with. And I took a year off from teaching at the time just to learn Photoshop, just to see whether this is something I really felt I could invest myself in as a new way of making an image. And in the beginning, I thought this wasn't going to work for me. And by the end of the year, it was just so automatic. I felt a connection to that mouse like I do a pencil.
Yeah.
So for me, it was like, I think this is going to work.
It's also funny, sorry to interrupt, playing with the Legos and seeing the grid. Thomas Byrell once said he was standing in a field of dandelions and he felt that they were pixels. So this way in which the pixel and the grid start to become, you know, just part of the everyday environment. Should I keep scrolling down?
Yeah, just go a little further. I want to just talk about, okay, so right in here. So these works, I'm going to sort of touch on photography again. So, you know, I originally went into photography because I wanted to get something more clinical in the work, as opposed to the hand created images. And for me, it wasn't trying to get it, you know, it was like, yeah, trying to get people to see I'm dealing with the body, but I felt the affect of the clinical was something very technological in a way that it is so real. And at this point, the technological advance of photography has been startling. And that is, in a way, an ontological change also, in the sense that I forget, maybe it was Baudrillard who said the public is going to become private and the private is going to become public. And that is that our private lives are becoming so transparent and public. At the same time, the public, we know so much about, almost too much about the world, and it's coming right into our bedroom, so to speak. And so it's this kind of realness that photography offers of something very intimate, like skin to whatever, that we see almost more through the photograph than we do even with our human eyes. And I think that's really apparent now, just as we go, you know, as we experience the news. And so this sense of this clinical microscopic focus is the affect of that I really wanted to be able to use. And that's what drove me to continue to work with the Photoshop that could use photographic images. However, what drove this is wanting to then go back and, in a way, invoke all of my work in painting, frankly. and what that world and history has done through time, and to bring that into this technological medium. And so in a way, I see these as paintings, but then I'm also working purely digitally. I say this only because by the time, this is after a year of work, this is my first experiments with the digital. And I should say digital imaging, but also printing on a wide format printer, which is very important. I don't think I would have gone down this road had that not developed simultaneously. And I think Epstein was seeing that emergence, that the demand for that. And then soon after I started working on the canvas, they announced that this was going to be archival now, which was the other important component. So, but when I finished this work here after a year, I felt somehow something was lacking because it was so controlled. I had all the control of technology, but I couldn't do anything more with it. So once it was done, it was done. And for me, that was something, the element of contingency, of risk, of chance, I really wanted back into the work. And it's not that I was trying to examine whether is this something that I just feel a personal connection to, or does it somehow resonate with what I'm seeing in the world? And I felt I wouldn't do that unless I felt I could see a connection. And I felt that in spite of the control that we have with technology, the sense of accident and risk going on in the world continues. And that's part of what the body is. And so that's drove me to want to bring back more traditional medium of some sort. And I wasn't yet sure what that would be that could work with the technological. Now, I could not just paint on this canvas. So I couldn't just invoke painting because one, I just felt once I started painting, I was bringing in the whole history of painting, and that was kind of antithetical to this kind of technological sense that I was going for. So I spent a number of years trying to figure out a way of bringing about back materiality, but within a kind of technological affect. Okay, so the other comment I want to make is just that with photography and this sort of clinical reality, I really then wanted to move the work more into the real world and to address issues of the real world. So in the '89 show with Pat, it was about surveillance, about the medical environment. These are contexts in which the body is interfacing with technology in society. And so the use of photography enabled me to do that in a way that would also, I could use this, as I said, the syntax of body and technology and address these more specific real world contexts. And that's what drove the work, after 2005.
Yep. All right. Now I'm going to bring in my part, my stuff. We've already had a kind of background conversation over the weekend about this. I do all my writing on a theorist named Willem Flusser, who was writing in the 1980s. He died in '91. And he had a column in Art Forum. Here's a book of his essays. I edited this, but initially he became well known for writing a book called Towards a Philosophy of Photography in 1983. And his idea was that we need to stop talking about images per se and instead talk about apparatuses, which might mean the camera. And of course, now everybody walks around with a camera all the time and everybody is a photographer. And so this is why this was very forward looking. But he was also, and this is what I'm spending my time on right now, is a chapter for a book that has to do with his book, Vampirotuthis Infernalis, about a squid and using that squid, that giant, it's not that giant of a squid, but as this, way of thinking through philosophy with an underwater animal. But for Flusser, this idea of photography in the digital realm and biotechnology were completely linked. And this is part of where I was mentioning this to Tishan over the weekend. I sent him a couple of things that had to do with this, so that when you start talking about, for him, skin in photography could be something like photographic paper because it functions in a very similar way in terms of being, photosensitive and having color. And skin, in the human skin, he would treat as a technological interface. And so one of the things, like as I read up on Tishan, and he was mentioning, Derrida, Deleuze, Baudrillard, some of the people in the 80s, this is just another person in the 80s, Willem Flusser, that is. But this is part of what I'm seeing and what I see in your work as well, is this convergence of, how to talk about technology in the body, and not just, as augmentation, or artificial intelligence in the most kind of basic form, but what you sort of stated initially, that these are, you might have been working intuitively, or referring, as you mentioned in the very beginning, in a kind of science fiction sense. So for Flusser, the idea was, he actually called his work science fiction philosophy, because it was speculative instead of this idea like, yeah, we know what we're talking about. The idea is, no, we don't always know what we're talking about. And this is particularly true in terms of art, in terms of bodies, in terms of technology, and sort of joining them all together. So that's the thing, the one thing I wanted to throw out there. I think I've touched on most of my, I can always go on and on and on in terms of references, oh, your drawings remind me of Juan Downey or something like that, somebody who is also interested in, environments and sculpture. Maybe we should, you could make any comments you want, and we should begin to open it up for the Q&A though. Do you have any things you want to?
Well, I just want to, because I just read the Flusser article, he was so prescient, and I guess I want to say something about sort of science fiction,
Yeah,
and the speculative. People always ask me if I'm interested in science fiction. I always had to say I'm not interested in science fiction, in the sense I'm not trying to create an imaginary world. For me, this is the real world, or the real world that is about to emerge. And I think what's interesting to me is science fiction has really grown as a genre in writing. And so it's taken much more space now in terms of serious literature. And it's partly because I think the world is moving so fast that before you can even think about it, we're already there. I mean, to me, the world we're living in right now is so science fictional. It's more wacky than any science fiction I've read, frankly. And so I think the Flusser's speculative writing is actually very accurate in terms of what I think was happening now, and about to happen in a much more obvious way, perhaps. So I think the sense of time and future past is really collapsing because things are moving so quickly, a lot driven by the speed of technology and the speed of capitalism, frankly. And so in a way, we have to recalibrate how we're seeing these kinds of these speculative projects that cultural producers make. We can hardly keep up. So in a way, I feel like the implications of Flusser's writing, in a way, are pointing directions of how we can really make sense of the world we are in right now, because I frankly cannot make sense of it anymore. I don't feel there's a present. There's only kind of anticipatory future that I can speculate as to what really is going on right now, because all of my past ways of organizing the world are not working anymore. So
I think what's even strange, I think one of the things that's very strange too is that when I walked in and saw your work at the Sculpture Center, if somebody had told me all of this work was made within the last 2 years, I wouldn't have been shocked, So that idea of, the kind of, just like you described, cultural producers and, the kind of speculative thing where you're going out on a limb and trying to imagine you're in the present and you're in the future, and of course in the past. So at any rate, that's why I'm so excited about your work as well. Should we, Catherine, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. If you guys are ready to move to Q&A, I can open it up. We have a lot of questions, and thank you so much for your generosity today. It's been truly fascinating. Our first question comes from Javier. Javier, I will pass you a mic now.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, nice to be here. It's great to have this chance to listen to you, Tishan. I think that the only time that I've listened to a talk of you was this that you gave in Art Basel like some years ago. I saw your work was actually in Hong Kong in a show that was curated by Venus Lau. And yeah, I was also like shocked that I didn't know of your work before. So when I first saw that work, I thought about like what is your concept or sense of device like in the work? Because, for example, the windows, I understand the windows could be like a device for looking into something else, as you were saying, like some illusion world. But there's also, like, for example, this image that we're seeing here. It's this kind of impossible devices, but there's also like the wheels, and it's kind of impossible. But at some point, there's this feeling that you can use it. And then when I saw the show in LA, I was also wondering if you when you were making these works back in the 80s and in the 90s, you had the idea that they were gonna talk to further generations the way they're doing. Like, I'm 35 years old. It's not that I'm like super technological as maybe younger generation, but I'm in between, you know, like those changes of technological devices and social media, etc. So yeah, those are my two questions. I could have like maybe 10 more, but I think I will keep to those two.
Okay, so let me just clarify the second question about this idea of talking to future generations, kind of what that was about. Is that one of the questions?
Yeah, and then how do you think about the device of,
okay, all right, good.
Work? Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of device, which is an object, that was another component very much that was part of what I was doing, and particularly in the sculptures. So what I saw and see now is that aside from the illusionary world of the digital, there is also the objects that we surround ourselves with are becoming more sentient. And they're also becoming, in a way, more human. And so that this technological world of devices, in other words, we have the technological world of the screen and the digital, but we also have devices, and I think that's a really important point. Whether it be cars or telephones or whatever, your kitchen appliances. So I could see where, as opposed to at the time, people were saying technology is this other to our humanness, and we want to kind of put it aside, that it was going to get closer and closer to us in a way, because that's where design was going. And that reflects my design background. And so it's interesting because Steve Jobs at Apple, that he was coming from that same understanding of what was going on in design. And so there was a kind of convergence there. I mean, I was using the round quarters for somewhat different reasons, but the idea that these objects not only physically were going to become the drivers were what feels good for the human body physically, rather than what looks interesting was driving design, or what feels good in your hand. But at the same time, the objects were going to be able to respond to us in a way that was unimagined. So we have now Alexa. So in terms of devices, in a way, it's becoming an illusionary world now. I mean, Alexa is a machine. And it's an illusion of a sentient being that we're talking to now. And this is a huge paradigm change. This is also unprecedented. So this is just beginning, and I really haven't been able to immerse myself in this. I mean, it's just one avenue really about this whole thing. And so that's the paradigm that I'm seeing, is that these objects now have a different ontology to us. This is beyond the consumer object, that we just buy things. This is where these things now are becoming part of the human hyphen object, and that we our humanness as an organic being perhaps is being diminished into something else. And I don't know what that, I mean, that's new stuff, that's new territory that we could, go into. The second question you had about this future idea, when I was doing the work, I was not thinking, I'm talking to the future or anything like that. I was just really trying to deal with the present, but in a way that I felt there was an opening here because this was new stuff to me. And so it was interesting. That was it. The fact that people now can see the work, I feel fortunate. I mean, this could have gone on for another 50 years and maybe people would see it or not. Who knows? You always do something very personal and it may not reach anybody. It may just be your personal thing, or it may eventually connect to a lot of other people, or another kind of consciousness. So that was all very speculative and I didn't want to, I didn't spend time thinking about that. It really was what's interesting enough for me to sustain getting up every day and doing this stuff. And for me, it's questions that I don't know the answers to, strangeness. And I was looking at what was strange in the world for me to really think about in the work. And that's what drove the work. And I had no idea of the iPad. I had no idea of Instagram. I hardly even knew what Instagram was, even when someone at the Hammer said, this looks like Instagram. I didn't know what they were referring to. So this is all purely sort of in the unconscious realm. Yeah. I proceeded within a kind of very rational, sort of plodding way, not thinking about all these other issues that we now can talk about. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from Christine Starkman. Christine, I will pass you a mic now.
Thank you. I wonder if we could go back to that first image that Javier was looking at also. Is that possible? I'm just so curious about that image. Well, my question was, in just looking at the painting and the sculpture, were the pairings of the sculpture made when installing, or they were made together? I guess I needed to look at the different dates, but the second part of my question is just the curiosity of this painting with the openings within openings. And it seemed, is it the same image that's repeated, but then added that other opening on the bottom, where it looks like just a tiny child in there? Is it the same one? And then, just thinking about, I did a big research on Warhol's flowers, and just understanding that on the wall, the way it's the orientation was changing, but it's the same image, but just added different orientation or added different things. So I'm trying to understand, and then the scale too, I guess in a way it gives us that bodily affect, because when you stand in front of that, there is that relationship of the body.
Okay, so to answer your first question, these works were done very different times. The sculpture was like early 90s, and then these digital were in the 2000s, or maybe 1995. No, the big one on the right that you're talking about is in the 2000s, and the gray silkscreen is like late 90s. But one of the things about this show, this survey, is that when I did each of these works at the time, they all seemed so different. And it's partly my kind of reticence about showing in these years, because I didn't really feel I understood enough to know what I really wanted people to look at. So I had all these different things, and I didn't, they didn't really cohere. And it's in the show, when it all put together, I realized suddenly that they do cohere, that they're really coming from something else that I wasn't aware of consciously in doing the work over the time. These works span almost 15 years here. So the bumps on the tile, are like nipples in the painting. And the skin is the skin. So there's very much a correlation. Okay. So to address the issue of the painting, I assume you're talking about the painting on the right. And yes, so one of the fascinating things that Photoshop as a technological tool allowed me to do with photography is to construct images in a very new way than painting, which I very much love painting. And that is to do exactly what you say, to take an image, to duplicate it, to morph it, and then duplicate it again in this endless combinations and permutations. And I didn't know at the time, because this is late 90s, when we didn't really have the internet yet as we do now. But this is also the way we are interacting with the digital world now. So the fact that we can copy and paste, we can send multiple people, we can, so this whole way of relating to reality through photography is very new and a part of this technological transition going on. So the fact that I was constructing the painting that way, at first I said, wait a minute, that's too easy. You can't just, and I said, no, wait a minute, that is what it wants to do. And what I look at is not how I did it, but what's the affect when it's there. And so for me, the duplication all comes together that I can do by hand because of the power of Photoshop and make it all feel like an organic whole. And the fact that it's duplicated, I mean, we could go into many different aspects of what that's about. Our cells are duplicating, we're just duplicated cells. And so there's all these kinds of biological references here. As to the scale, I was very much interested, as I spoke about in the earlier silkscreen, is a sense of this skin that goes on, and that it's not about looking at an image as a window into a world, that you stand there and it just goes on. It's beyond your bodily scale.
Yeah.
And it's that sense that it's all over. You have to get into it. You're sort of into this. You're not looking at it. That's kind of what the scale was, what was driving the scale. Yeah.
Thank you. It's all sort of this idea of a mise en abîme, a picture within a picture, a picture within a picture.
Yeah. Kind of like the idea of hyperlink, or,
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Our next question comes from a Rail friend, Lynn Crawford. Lynn, I will pass you a mic now. Oops. Yeah, you should be able to, yeah.
Me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I had a question. You'd mentioned techno music, and I was just reading an interview with Florian Schneider, one of the founders of Kraftwerk, and he said, cool is an emotion too. And I would just love to hear you talk about that line. Cool is an emotion too.
Yeah, I love that line. You hit it right on the nose. I mean, the Judd show is up right now at MoMA. So, when Judd came out, I remember seeing his work very early on, and it was like, what is it? It's just a box, and it's only after we saw many, many, many Judds in shows not unlike what we see at MoMA now, where you see the whole thing, you realize there is an affect there. There's a feeling to it. Mm-hmm. He would be the last person to talk about it, perhaps. He's trying to get art to be super concrete, like Cézanne. But in fact, I think what we learned is no matter what you do, no matter how much you want to reduce something, there's always going to be some subliminal affect quality that comes out. And perhaps that's what makes it art. That's what makes us human, that we don't know yet whether we're just projecting into it. But so the fact that, cool is an affect is exactly that. This gets very philosophical. We could have a very expressionistic painting only in contrast to what we know as very cool and very restrained and very minimal. I think that's what the striking thing about minimalism was. It established cool as an affect in a way art history had never done before. And I think that's the production of this technological age that we were just emerging into. In a way, is very prescient in a way. So the cool of minimalism is the cool of our laptops or our phones. And I think that experience is partly what I think is worthwhile examining a little bit, as we just are inundated with this stuff so quickly and moving into it so fast, is, what is the feeling we're getting here? And that segues into just our own agency. And I think it's particularly poignant right now, politically, is that this technology is so powerful and is doing so much. And we need to get a handle of it, because it's really beginning to manipulate everything we build our lives on in a way that we never imagined. And so this idea of affect, I think, is critical in that context.
Thank you.
Can I also just add a point too, in terms of minimalism and techno, is that you have this direct link between, Steve Reich, Terry Riley, Tony Conrad, Lamont Young, people like that. And then all of a sudden you have in the 70s, you have German techno and 70s and 80s and things like that. And so I can only speak for myself, but it's part of a continuum, you know, of what I love in terms of minimalism in music, and then techno even into the present.
Yeah, very much so. I very much have the same sense.
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from Adam. Adam, I will pass you a mic now.
Yes, I was wondering about with Instagram and so many people posting videos to it, especially teenagers and even the generation after that. Do you think that that will affect the mediums of painting and clay, for example? And what would that do to museums, would you say? Thanks.
I wouldn't begin to speculate how this is going to affect, you know, future generations and people who are like 25 now trying to, you know, figure out what they want to as cultural producers. I'm sure it will. I remember talking to my son and friends of his about, you know, wanting to talk about technology and understanding Instagram. And they said, you know, you should just use Instagram just to see sort of what's there. But so I am sure that it will, or put it this way, I'm sure someone or a few people, if not more, will come up with something really interesting that comes out of this immersion in social media in a way that I have not experienced, because just of my generation. I feel I have enough on my hands just dealing with what I've experienced so far, and it's a matter of breadth and depth. And right now I'm looking for depth in what I'm doing. Sometimes it's frustrating because there's so much out there now in terms of technology in the body and politically, medically, to talk about, to address in a work. But I kind of have to, I work organically. I work where I am and then I work out. So, yeah, I mean, I think I've often been imagined, you know, if someone did a work that's using Instagram in some way. But I think you have to be careful here, because all through the years, I have followed closely artists who are using technology or talking about technology, and even coming from my, you know, at MIT that was trying to start up a kind of art department, which now is quite substantial actually. But a lot of the work of technology gets seduced by the technology. And I think that's why it hasn't always taken on, or it hasn't convinced the more traditional contemporary art world, because the technology itself is not what it's about. I think that's really important. So whether someone can kind of get beyond Instagram as an affect and move into something that comes out of it, that remains to be seen. Yeah, that's what my answer.
I would add to that two things. One is the longer that you teach, which Tishan and I both have done. I'm still doing it actively. And you start to teach generations of people who were raised entirely with the internet or different gadgets, is that the assumption in the old days, say 10, 15 years ago, is that that generation would be interested in making digital art. Whereas the exact opposite is true. They would rather work with ceramics, textiles. They want the tactile. They want anything but the digital. And they think this is my experience of teaching undergraduate BFAs. The other thing in terms of the body and Instagram, like what you described, is that like the reason I pulled up this one is there's this kind of feedback loop. And one of the people who's on here today, Lydia, hey Lydia, who's a former student and TA of mine, is one of the people who clued me into this real culture around people shaping their bodies around surgery and, well, surgery, fillers, whatever you want to call it, for Instagram, you know, because I'm not of the generation where I just sort of understood that. And then Lydia sent me this article and I was like, what? You know, and now of course I know. But so this whole idea of technology in the body, and that it's not just we're representing it or artists are representing it. We, if we're photographing with our phones, but that people are actually shaping, their bodies to see how they'll look on, on Instagram, basically.
Yeah. And the whole idea of just even persona, we're creating these fictitious bodies as well. To go back, Martha, what you were mentioning just about the materiality, I experienced that as well when I was teaching, and I was surprised. And the students were not interested in technology. They wanted the most traditional media. And I thought that was really great. I thought that was very encouraging. And that paralleled which sometimes I've questioned, maybe I'm too retro, that I want to maintain a materiality in the work, even though I'm talking about technology. And this came up early on in the 80s when artists went to say, why don't you just manufacture everything? You should be working technologically, period. And a lot of the struggle and the slowness of the work is how to work technology, but still maintain a materiality, because I think that is not just a kind of aesthetic preference, but has to do with our bodily material existence that is still really fundamental. And I think that may be why young people in BFA programs still want that material, that body connection to what they're doing. And there aren't many places you can do that anymore. Everybody's on their mouse and their iPhones. And where in the world can you work with your hands anymore? So it's like a new world in a way.
Yeah. And of course, we didn't know back then that was going to lead to high rates of depression, anxiety, that your connection to your device is directly, not exactly enhances mental health. But the thing is that also with your work, the fact, like what you just described, is that there are orifices and nipples and mouths and eyes, popping out or hovering within these works is part of, I think, what makes them so eminently satisfying.
Thank you so much, Adam, for that question, and Martha and Tishan for your answers. Our next question comes from Alina Tenser. I will read her question on her behalf. She said, something that has stood out to me in Tishan's work is the use of real and implied affordances. Are these connected to the way you speak about effect? That is the question.
I'm sorry, you're going to have to tell me what you mean by affordances.
Okay, maybe I'll ask her to unmute if she's able.
Hi. So when I speak about affordances, I'm referring to, or the term affordances refers to parts of objects or environments that allow bodies, or like afford bodies a way of interacting with them. So whether it's the use of handles, the use of orifices and knobs or nipples in the work, that sort of give the viewer a way of like directly interacting in that way, in a very physical way. Also looking at the sculptures, like where, like at what level they're located, sort of often table height or I don't know, other types of equipment at that sort of height.
Okay, so if I understand you, so I think what you're picking up is that in trying to bring in the body into a technological iconography or format, I could not use the figure ground format that has been in the Western tradition for centuries. And at the same time, I could not go into an abstract mode where, in a way, I mean, in modernism, the abstraction is about the world becoming so abstract with science, and that the body really is about, the molecules and the genes or whatever. It's not about anything that we see. So I was trying to go for something. I said, could there be a third way that resonated with what I was experiencing in this paradox of body and then the screen or the illusionary, the technological illusionary? And so I had to, in a way, I can't just paint a figure like you do in classical, figurative drawing. That would not convey anything. Or put it this way, it would not convey this affect that I'm talking about. So I had to do something that had a body affect, but actually was emerging out of the technology. So that's this idea of how to fuse the two together. And in a way, they sometimes feel a little awkward looking back at them. And that awkwardness is probably because I'm really struggling how to do this. So the affordances are really giving you handles to connect to body as a reference for the work without positioning you in front of an image of a body. And at the same time, not just doing abstract work. For instance, I could have had just all this like all over, just layers of skin, that's it. Like in this one, for instance. But I wanted to somehow get it more specific. Remember, everybody was saying, what is your work about? They didn't know what to think. Some people said these are musical instruments because of the lines. Or they say, are you trying to do landscapes? Or are you trying to do the moon? So the affordances kind of give you a handle, and you use the word handle, that connects you to somehow the body. Now, in this case, the literal handles are something else. I mean, that's more, this is a kind of abstracting of a technological device. It's not specific to any one, but it brings in the affects of the screen, the monitor, the handles of architectural environments that are very technological in a way that, design was getting, the minimalist aesthetic, put it that way. This is also could be referencing just the wires within a computer board, for instance, that connect two physical things. So there's a kind of metaphorical aspect to my choices of these affordances that you're referring to.
And also, when I first saw it, it kind of made me think of sound waves or brain waves, and those kind of monitors in hospitals. Because I put all these things up, I of course want to use them all. One of the things that is interesting, this is a review of one of your shows from, probably the one from '86. But I thought it was very interesting when you guys are mentioning abstraction. As art critics, we just do the best we can, and we're working on a deadline, and we gotta, what can I say? We're just doing the best we can. But this idea that abstraction would have been an area to, go in and think about your work at the time. And so this was Donald Cuspit, that he was responding to the work, again, I think this is '86. Where he says, I think Sue's artistic point is that abstraction lends itself to articulating life forms, particularly the technologically innovated forms of elementary life. He implies that abstraction is not only the natural, quote unquote, natural language of the modern technological world, but is also the inherent language of nature, which operates with abstract technologic. I mean, he kind of nailed it in a sense here, but it's funny because my first, as a critic of a younger generation than him, I wouldn't have gone in straight through abstraction. I went into, other things like, I don't know, probably like embodiment, artificial intelligence, things like that. Anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I was never thinking about abstraction as well. To me, that's a very academic term and a very academic way of looking at art. So I always looked at the art as what is its implication for reality at any given period in time, historically.
Yeah,
so
sorry, go ahead, sorry.
No, that's it.
At the same time, for those of us, and he's an art historian too, how do you teach minimalism? Number one, how do you describe it? You say it's geometric abstraction. So in a sense, I can sort of understand why he went in through that thing, is he thought, oh, here's some kind of like post-minimalist sculpture, and let's think about how it relates to, the abstraction of minimalism and so on.
Well, I think the term abstract is really important and profound. So I think writers, you need a vocabulary to talk about things that are very difficult to talk about.
Yeah.
Just as the maker, I didn't think intellectually in that way. So I think his invoking abstraction is relevant and interesting as one way of getting into the work. And I mean, I even used it a little bit, I think, earlier on when I said there was a certain abstractness to the work early on when it feels like very disconnected. I think one comment recently, someone was saying it's like in a vacuum. And that was kind of, I was aware of that. So I don't think there's anything wrong with abstraction as an understanding of something. I think it's important, particularly in the world we're in.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Michael. I will pass you a mic now.
Hi, this is a great conversation. Thank you. It's interesting that Martha mentioned Richard Brautigan, because as you were talking, I was thinking about a book called Watermelon Sugar. Mm-hmm. And in that story, it was a story about people who kind of lived in a society where technology took care of everything for everybody. And they kind of lived in kind of naive happiness, I guess. And there were these other group of people who were dystopian, and they wanted to go back to the old machines because they thought that the other people lived in a superficial world. So that being said, my question is, what are you working on now? And where do you see the future of art going, of your work going?
So I'm working on now is a number of things. I'm preparing for an installation at the Guangzhou, which is an iteration of the wall that's in the Sculpture Center, the digital wall with the body images. And that image is morphing. And that's one of the aspects that the digital is allowing me to do with printing. The concept being, well, the number of things. One is, when I did this work in 2000, this wall piece, one of the things I really was interested in, the idea that I could do this digitally. It's a file. It's so invisible. So the carbon footprint is negligible. And so I was imagining, so let's say I had a show at the time, so I can send the file to Guangzhou in South Korea, and then they're printing it there, and then they're going to install it on a wall there, but it's in a whole different wall. It's a site-specific installation in a sense. It becomes a site-specific installation. And they started out in the context of the image on canvas, like a painting. So I like that seamless evolution that can happen as a result of the technological Photoshop, the software. And at the same time, this was like in 2002, and now it's 2021. So this work is also morphing, like the technology itself. And what I can do in Photoshop now is much more than what I could do then. And so I'm adding to it, but using this still. And I like that interesting way it's kind of growing technologically. So in terms of I'm also working on sculpture, and I'm working a lot with photography now on board. So I'm kind of fusing the digital with the earlier woodwork. I've also been printing on aluminum, but I somehow like the wood quality. So the general direction of the work is, for me, this survey show really are like points on a kind of journey or road that I've come from. And at every point, I never felt I had the luxury to stop and just do a lot of work around any particular thing, because I was seeing the next thing already. And that's partly why my exhibition kind of schedule slows down, because I just wanted to keep going. With the survey show, I personally have a much clearer sense of what all the work really was about. The work really reveals to me what it is. And now I sort of want to go back and really clarify a lot of the work that was going on and recombine it in very different ways than what I could have imagined then, partly because the technology now, the image making technology, as well as the material technology, has changed so much, it's allowing many other things to happen. So for instance, I use silicone now, which didn't exist for artists in the 2000 at that point. And then the digital technology and the printing substrates have all changed now. They're much more archival, they're much more permanent. So all of this I want to explore now. What was your second question? I'm sorry.
I don't remember. Thank you. It's really interesting that the technology is like, some people can work with the technology. Some people, feel less comfortable. Like you said, this younger generation is not reacting to it. It's like it's too much, too available. So it's not inspiring them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The one quick thing I would add to this also is, in the 80s, this idea of immaterialism, because Tishan was just talking about sending files and the kind of immateriality, which is another really key point with photography all of a sudden becoming completely dematerialized, except for when it's printed out and has to be archival and things of that nature. But you had shows like Les Immatériaux, which was co-organized by a philosopher, Lyotard, in Paris. And there's been a lot of look back at this show. And it had to do with this idea of like how everything's becoming immaterial. And that did include, whoops, this is from one of my lectures. But it did include everything from technical images, which is what Flusser calls photography, so that you can discuss the entire expanse of still moving images, satellite images, artistic images, x-rays, whatever. But it's just really interesting how there is, like what you were saying, when you look back at your work and you're like, oh, that's what it was about. That, when it is speculative like that, and then like in the very beginning of this talk, you were mentioning, I think, J.G. Ballard or one of the science fiction writers, and that we look at that and that looks more prescient and sort of like, wow, that was really on spot. As opposed to something that might have been, journalistic or historical or philosophical at the time, that the kind of speculation turns out to be, oddly more real or more accurate. Anyway, just this show is something that has been revisited quite a bit in recent years.
Thank you so much. Our final audience question comes from Lydia. Lydia, I will pass you a mic now.
Hi, thank you everyone for this conversation. And I joined late, so apologies if this was maybe touched on already. I'm really curious about your relationship to color temperatures and how those are kind of, associated with certain things in particular, as you touched on, like somebody brought up like the idea of cool being a feeling or an affect in and of itself, and, just color temperatures as well, like the cool, the calculated, the pristine, and then, the organic, the bodily, and how those, those tend to, diverge on, kind of color temperature lines. And also kind of going back to something you said about the possibility of mistakes and the idea of perfection and sort of like this clean culture, which I think is definitely correlates with digital culture and I think our current kind of mentality and this like pursuit of bodily perfection. So yeah.
Okay, you brought up lots and lots of issues, so it's hard to. I'll have to kind of just choose a few things.
Yeah, no pressure.
I thought it was interesting you mentioned color temperature. No one's ever put color in that context. So, I mean, I was trained. I had a rigorous training in color in my early training, and so I always wanted color to be in the work. Put it that way. It's one reason why I chose tile. The particular tile I use is that it comes in many colors and that the color is inherent in the material itself. So the color does have a register for me, and that's a very personal kind of expressive thing. Like here, for instance, the aqua is really the aqua of media. At the time, screens are more greenish than bluish. But in other times, certainly I use a lot of body tones, skin tones. So that is very important to me in terms of whatever I do. I know a lot of, in grad school programs, they don't really emphasize that anymore, but I find it really important, and I will always look at a painting, a really great painting that really knows how to handle color. So in terms of the I'm throwing a blank right now. So what was the second issue that you went into? I mentioned.
Well, the idea of like minimalism as being cool and calculated and detached.
Good.
And then, these ideas of cool colors and yeah.
So one aspect of my work, I think, is that I'm always interested in bringing what seems to be opposite qualities or opposite affects, to combine them, to somehow integrate them, because I think the world we're living in is that way. So we can have very cool, we're totally immersed in a technological world, but we have all of the messiness of our bodily existence going on at the same time. And because we're in the moment we're in right now, just look at in terms of the use of social media, which is technology, and politically. I mean, that's supposed to be a kind of control and everybody, and yet it's spilling over into something that's so unpredictable, so unimagined and unable to be dealt with. It's no different than if we were in the 15th century in a way, in terms of what we're doing with ourselves. So for me, it's not just a choice in a way. It's really trying to match the reality or to correlate with reality in some way. So for me, reality has all those aspects. In a way, I think reality actually, the aspects are more extreme now than they ever were, because the cool is an entirely new emergence as an affect, if not an actual material reality that has never existed before. And it has emerged in the last 20 years in a way that's so far beyond even cool manufactured objects. We're in the 21st century now. That cool is our cognitive, psychological, emotional, for better or for worse, affect. And so those are very messy areas I'm talking about. So it's an integrated reality. How to integrate it, I think that's what's causing people to go into therapy. I mean, it's very hard to understand how to manage all this. And I think that's one role I think as a cultural producer, art can begin to do, is that people give a sense of something that we haven't been able to get a sense of, really. I can remember when I first saw Rauschenberg's Bed as a 7th grader, and it was on Time magazine cover. And I just saw it immediately. I said, this is how I feel. Before I saw that, there was nothing, no literature, no painting that I saw that identified that feeling even in me. I didn't know I had that feeling until I saw that work. I said, this is really how I feel. So that's my comment on your question. Yeah.
I think I would also add, because when you talk about the sort of coolness of colors of objects, something that would be, I mean, a whole other discussion, but around design, So in the way that Apple products, have really copied the German design of Dieter Röhm, and there's just, I mean, quite clearly, Apple has become this mega empire around the design of the objects, and the fact that it's cool and yet it's very enticing. And so I think when I look at, a couple of your sculptures, I have that same feeling, the kind of affect of something that is very cool and, somewhat almost kind of clinical, and yet it is desirable. You want to walk up and you want to look at this. And of course, what you can't do with art that you can do with your devices, you want to touch it, but no touching. So, but obviously, as we talk about our devices and our devices becoming prosthetic, and that, the iPad and the phone is all about, touch and tactility. And so I think that yours has this thing where we can't run our hands all over it. Although curators and art dealers, I know one of the art dealers I know, he said, he became an art dealer because he wanted to touch the objects. And one of my colleagues, Jerry Saltz, if you're ever hanging around with him, he's always running his hands over people's work. So there is a way in which, you know, I really have to say your work is very tactile.
Well, that's good to hear. I know people have said they never would have imagined the work to look the way it does, having looked at it only through digital images. So that for me affirms the body, that there's something that you experience through your body's interaction with the work that is different. I think this issue of the development of Apple and its actual business plan and the wanting to touch and then development of my own work, there is some central driver here, is that design, the cool of the 20th century, let's say in the Bauhaus, or even in the Mies architecture of just grid, morphed into an Apple design, which is really about the body, which is about seduction, which is sort of also about capitalism. So how is it going to seduce you to want its stuff? And it got it closer to your body. So you know, it's almost sensual, it's not sexual. So my work in a way is trying to tap into an ontological, a kind of cognitive sense of that, which is this cool that has now migrated into a kind of body cool. And that is how I'm able to then start talking about technology in the body on a more ontological, philosophical level, rather than a capitalist product level, although they're actually connected. I mean, Apple created the world that my work is responding to, so it's all kind of one. So it's interesting, Martha, you just brought this up, because I feel like it's like a paradigm in a way you're mentioning.
Yeah, and in terms of it being, you know, connected with sort of, you know, the post-Bauhaus, there was the design school at Ulm, which was a post-Bauhaus school, and another one, the Institute of the Environment in Paris in the late 60s and early 70s. And they were trying to sort of move away from art, and that's where Dieter Röhm, you know, was in Ulm, and then that's what Apple has ripped off as his entire thing. That's a side note. But the other thing too, I wasn't surprised that you had an architectural background after, you know, when I saw your work, and then I was like, oh yeah, so that's a whole other, you know, design, architecture, technology, gadgets. I mean, it's, you know, that's a whole other conversation.
My design training at MIT is perhaps different than what people might expect. Even though MIT was like super technological, the architecture department really was starting with indigenous architecture, like handmade architecture. And what they were trying to get us to do as designers is, how can we infuse these wonderful environments that were all made by hand into a technological fabrication method that we have to use. So in a way, it was also bringing in this idea of the human as the body, the things made by the body, into a technological context.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I
and it
had that
doesn't
thinking,
even
in the training.
In the current moment, people are even taking that out further. So it's not even just indigenous architecture, but it's non-human architecture. So for instance, termite mounds, you know, or a beaver's dam or something like that. These kind of like structural, that look in the art world to many of us like sculpture too, that are just like incredible structures, incredibly ingenious.
Yeah, I think that's a direction the future is going, frankly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Before we go to poetry, we'll have some closing remarks from our very own Phong Bui. Phong, you should be able to activate your mic.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Tishan. It's like the best graduate seminar, but it's for free, and it's done by two brilliant people. So thank you. I like what you say earlier, Tishan, where you say that it's important to create your own paradox. I mean, this whole conversation is really one way to amplify that paradox, but one has to create that one's own paradox. I was actually telling my assistant Kyle, because he's reading Dory Aston's book, New York School Culture Reckoning. And in the beginning, in her author's note, she say, if I remember correctly, one of my favorite philosophers is Gaston Bachelard. And she say, I like particularly his unbounded contempt for those who, like the psychoanalyst, try to explain the flower by the fertilizer. Knowing about an artist's ambient doesn't quite guarantee or explain his or her own work, you know? So that creating the paradox is really not that dissimilar than bringing the two rocks together and strike it to get a fire or energy. But my question is this: it's brilliant back and forth and all of that immersive, you know, references. But two that I would like to bring forth is one is Lee Bontakil, who I have the pleasure to meet and have dinner many times to Dory. She used to teach at the Brooklyn College. So every time she taught, she would spend the night at Dory. And sometimes I get invited to have dinner with her. And I remember, you know, Judge, in a way, Martha's review of you reminded me of Don Judge's review of her work in the 60s, where it say he loved the work because it served its own existence in both form and power. You know, what that meant is that as we know her work, it's really a collision between organic invention or organic shapes that create this intense energy, but only when it does, because of its expansiveness, openness, and embracing the process of engineering. You know, it's a very strange, frictional, in a way, polarity. And the other one I'm thinking of, because you talked earlier about eliminate edges, you know, Tishan.
Yes.
I can't help but think of Ron Gorchov, one of the great painters who were able to eliminate that problem. So I'm asking in terms of how, at the time you were doing, would both of their work, did neither ever came into your own perception and process of thinking about what was happening in the 80s, late 80s?
So I was very aware of Ron Gorchov's work. I mean, he's a little older than I am.
Yeah.
And I definitely can see a connection. I mean, actually, I mean, Judd's early work also connects to that, this kind of more aestheticized object, but very much an object on the wall. And then Lee Bontakil, I remember seeing very early on. I was completely taken by the work. I really didn't see the connection to my work until later. You know, I can see directly, people would say, you know, this reminds them of Bontakil's work. I was totally blown away by her work. I remember when I think I might have seen that at a biennial or something. And I think Lee Bontakil's work, I mean, she was, you know, mid 20th century, later 20th century, you know, there was a definitely sense of the machinic and the body. And so that's how I was trying to clarify what I was trying to do, that I was seeing that machinic had morphed now into what we call the technological through the digital. And that's a kind of, it's a whole nother, it comes from the machinic, but it's like a quantum jump in a way. So I thought that's the newer area that I need to be clear about and not get into the machinic. And so that clarified what I was doing, yeah. Right. I needed her work to clarify what I was doing. That's how I was gonna say.
Oh, okay. it's like Gorchov have to deal with that aspect with Gorky and de Kooning before coming his own. Thank you. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Phong. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending lunch with poetry, and today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Maggie Dubri, to the stage. Maggie Dubri is a New York City-based writer and sound artist. She worked for 25 years as a paramedic, which inspired her most recent book, Broke Down Palace. Among other projects, she's currently working on an opera called Broke. She also does underwater field recording in the parks and rivers of the city. And I will post some links in the chat about Maggie. Maggie, I'm passing you a mic now.
Hi, thanks so much, Catherine. And this was such a great event. It was so inspiring to me, just brilliant. So I'm just gonna read for about 5 minutes from my book. Can you see it? Yes. Broke Down Palace, which came out last year from Subpress, which is a small press. And it's drawn from my experience as a paramedic. I worked as a 911 paramedic for really from 1980 to 2007. So I'm just going to read two kind of poem-like things. 1982. My realm is a jumble of mazes and labyrinths, illusions, riddles, mysteries. It's fun to solve a mystery when you live amongst the gods. Immortal, dealing out mortality night after night. A summer evening in New York City, a basement apartment. A young man barely out of his teens, sitting on a wet bed beside his dad. His breath smells funny, like bread. His face is finely sculpted, as if all the fat has been burned away in a terrible fire. It's a look I will later come to associate with gay men. He's pale, with purple blotches like pomegranate seeds on his face and arms. So weak he can't walk. He doesn't know what's wrong with him. No one knows what's wrong with him. But I do. Buried in one of my medical magazines was an article on Kaposi's sarcoma, a previously rare and benign cancer of elderly Italians, now showing up in an apparently mutant form in young gay men. On the West Coast, doctors are calling it GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. Very rare, 452 cases in the whole United States, 453 now. I wish I could remember being afraid or even feeling sad for this man to be so sick, so young. But I was besotted by my own powers, proud to have made this impressive diagnosis, not yet able to see that Mount Olympus was scaled long ago, our palaces sacked, our gorges flooded with germs and sorrow. And I'm not Demeter, but Persephone, damned by the mortal pain I so carelessly consume. Then the next and last one I'm going to read is called What's Actually Interesting. As I'm working on revising and cutting today, I keep wondering what's actually interesting. Does anyone care that my partner Errol at Met used to have dreams in 1981 that guided us when we played the numbers? Now that there are no numbers and hardly anyone remembers Ching Chow. In the year of our Lord, 1927, an inscrutable cartoon entitled Ching Chow appeared in the New York Daily News. We never actually hit, but we always came close. That was what kept us going. Some of the other guys at Met used Ching Chow, but they didn't have any better luck than us. I remember someone teaching me how to do it one night. It had to do with counting the horizontal lines. For 63 years, Ching Chow's elliptical captions graced those pages. If you knew what to look for, if you had the knack, you could predict the outcome of the daily numbers game. There was a place we would drive to, I think on 2nd Avenue, where you could put down money, for us, $3, and then periodically stop by to find out which numbers had come in. The first one, the second one, then by the end of the shift, they had 3. Everyone played the numbers that broke down Brick Road to riches. We'd get the first 2, then the rest of the shift, we'd talk about what we were going to buy with our loot. Now that there's the legal lottery games, no one plays the numbers. Is it interesting that we did? That it was so woven into life in the 80s, no one even thought about it? At some point, everyone who played the numbers will be dead. Then, will people want to know the details? Or will it just be like vacuum cleaner bags? Like, who cares? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Maggie.
Thank you.
And thank you, Tishan and Martha, and thank you everyone who tuned in today and for all the wonderful questions and comments in the chat. This past October marked the Rail's 20th anniversary, and we're celebrating all the way through 2021. So please consider making a contribution to keep the Rail and our special projects free, relevant, and independent, like these lunchtime conversations and the We the Immigrants project. Every amount matters, and our goal is to double last year's participation and reach 500 donors. I'll post some links in the chat, or you can ask one of our team members for more info. And please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Lisa Pearson of Siglio Press and Rail editor-at-large Constance Llewellyn. We'll conclude with a poetry reading from Adam DeGraff. And you should all be able to activate your mics if you'd like to say goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bravo.
Thanks, Tishan. Thanks, Martha.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martha.
Brilliant
Thank you,
Conversation.
Tishan.
Can't wait to watch it again on
Thanks,
YouTube.
Maggie, for your poem.
Thank you, Maggie.
Beautiful,
Thank you, Maggie, so much.
Thank you for the beautiful reading, Maggie. Also.
Beautiful reading.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tishan.